When 23-year-old Inga Probst was told she could walk freely through a British city without chains or guards, she was certain it was a trap, because everything she'd been taught promised torture, enslavement and death at enemy hands. The moment she realized her captors were treating her with kindness would shatter her entire worldview more violently than any bomb ever could. Lodge Moor Camp, Sheffield, England, November 12, 1945. 23-year-old Luftwaffe Helferin Inga Probst stood frozen at the camp gate, her hands trembling at her sides. Not from cold, though the November wind cut through her grey auxiliary uniform. Not from fear, though her heart hammered against her ribs. She was trembling because her hands were free. "You may walk about freely," the British officer said in accented but clear German. Captain Margaret Wilson of the ATS gestured toward the waiting lorry. "We're taking you to Sheffield city centre." To shop. Inga glanced at the other 15 German women selected for this outing. Their faces mirrored her confusion. This had to be a trick. In the 8 months since capture, they'd been waiting for the real British to show themselves. The monsters from the propaganda films, the ones who would chain them, starve them, violate them. Instead, they'd received 3 meals daily, medical care, and now this, an invitation to visit a British city. Unsupervised, unshackled. "Is this... are we?" stammered Hildegard Kuhn, a former signals auxiliary who'd been captured near Cuxhaven. "Are we to be paraded? For the crowds?" Captain Wilson's expression softened. "No, dear, you're going shopping. The YMCA has authorized a small allowance. You'll need warmer clothes for winter." This was impossible. And yet, 20 minutes later, Inga found herself standing on a Sheffield street watching British civilians go about their daily lives. No one spat at her. No one screamed Hun nor threw stones. A woman with a pram smiled politely as she passed. An elderly man tipped his hat. Everything Inga Probst had been taught was a lie. And that realization was more terrifying than any torture could have been. The believers. To understand the psychological earthquake these women experienced, we must first understand what they believed, and why they believed it so absolutely. Between 1940 and 1945, approximately 429,000 German military personnel were held as prisoners of war in British camps. Among them were roughly 15,000 women, a figure that often surprises those who assume POWs were exclusively male. These weren't combat soldiers, but auxiliaries, the Helferinnen who had served as radio operators, anti-aircraft gun assistants, administrative staff, nurses, and in countless support roles that freed up men for frontline combat. The majority were young, between 18 and 25 years old. Most had joined voluntarily, many with genuine enthusiasm. They'd grown up under National Socialism, been shaped by the Bund Deutscher Mädel, League of German Girls, and believed absolutely in the righteousness of their cause and the evil of their enemies. Irmgard Meyer, Nachrichtenhelferin captured in May 1945, would later recall in a 1978 interview. "We were not stupid girls, you understand. Many of us had education. I had completed gymnasium. But we had been told every day, every week, every year what the British were. We saw the films of Hamburg burning. We heard the stories from the Eastern Front about Soviet atrocities. We were taught that the British and Americans would be just as bad, maybe worse, because they were hypocrites who pretended to be civilized. The propaganda was sophisticated and relentless. Ministry of Propaganda materials specifically targeted at women auxiliaries emphasized sexual violence, enslavement, and torture. A 1944 Goebbels directive to military women's units explicitly stated, "Capture by the Anglo-American enemy means dishonor worse than death. They will parade you naked through streets, abuse you for their soldiers' entertainment, work you to death in mines. Better the cyanide capsule than British captivity." When Inga Probst was captured near Bremen on April 28, 1945, she genuinely expected to die, or worse. The 17-year-old British soldier who took her prisoner seemed as confused about what to do with her as she was terrified of what he would do. He'd offered her a cigarette and called for a female officer. She'd refused the cigarette, certain it was poisoned. The awakening begins. The first cracks in the propaganda edifice came not from grand gestures but from small, mundane acts of basic humanity. The German women POWs were initially held in several camps across Britain. the largest being Lodgemore Camp near Sheffield, Comrie Camp in Scotland, and Camp 186 at Wilton Park. Upon arrival, most expected immediate abuse. What they received instead was processing, medical examination, and assignment to barracks. Dr. Eleanor Bradford, a British medical officer at Lodgemore, noted in her official report, dated June 3, 1945, "The German women prisoners arrive in a state of extreme psychological distress. Many refuse medical examination, believing we intend to sterilize them or worse. One young woman, approximately 19 years old, attempted to resist examination so violently that she had to be sedated. When she woke and found she'd been treated for nothing more than a gynecological infection and severe malnutrition, she wept for 2 hours. The weeping wasn't relief. It was cognitive dissonance made manifest. For women like Inga Probst, every day brought new contradictions. The food, while rationed and simple, was adequate, often better than what she'd eaten in the final months of the war. The barracks heated and weatherproof. The guards professional and correct. Where was the brutality? Where was the revenge? We told ourselves they were fattening us up for something worse, recalled Christa Vogel, an anti-aircraft auxiliary captured in Hamburg in a 1982 oral history. Some of the older women said they were making us healthy enough for hard labor in mines or factories. We created explanations because we couldn't accept that we'd been lied to. That lie was too big. It meant everything else might be lies too. The British authorities, meanwhile, were navigating unprecedented territory. The Geneva Convention provided clear guidelines for male POWs, but less specific direction for female prisoners. The decision was made to apply the same basic standards: humane treatment, adequate food and shelter, medical care and recreation. But some British officials wanted to go further. They wanted to re-educate. The Wilton Park experiment. On July 15, 1945, the British Foreign Office established an unusual facility at Wilton Park in Buckinghamshire. While it would later become famous for re-educating German officers, its initial program included a cohort of 147 German women auxiliaries, selected for their education level and perceived leadership potential among the female POWs. The man behind this experiment was Heinz Kupler, a German Jewish refugee who'd fled to Britain in 1935 and became a British citizen. Now a British Army officer, with the rank of Lieutenant Colonel, Kepler believed that German POWs could be shown, not told the truth about Nazism and democracy. His approach was radical. Treat the prisoners with respect, expose them to uncensored information, encourage debate, and let cognitive reality slowly dismantle propaganda's fortress. Among the 147 women sent to Wilton Park was Inga Probst. Her diary from this period, now housed in the Imperial War Museum, provides an extraordinary window into a mind at war with itself. August 3, 1945. Today they showed us newspapers. British newspapers, American newspapers, even Swedish ones, all showing photographs from the camps. Belsen, Buchenwald, Dachau, they must be forgeries. They must be. The British are skilled at forgeries, and yet there are so many. And the faces. I cannot stop seeing the faces. August 10, 1945. A German officer, a colonel captured in France, spoke to us today. He said the camps were real. He said he saw one. He's lying, or he's a traitor, or he's been tortured into saying this. But he didn't look tortured. He looked broken, like something inside him had died. August 19, 1945. They took us to the cinema, not to watch British propaganda, but to watch German propaganda, our own films. And then they discussed them with us, pointing out the techniques, the lies, the manipulation. I felt sick, not because they were criticizing the films, because I could see it. Once they pointed it out, I could see how we'd been manipulated. Have I been blind? The psychological pressure was immense. Kepler's team included psychologists, educators, and German anti-Nazi émigrés. They didn't force, they questioned. They didn't punish doubt, they encouraged it. For women raised in a system that demanded absolute certainty, this approach was devastating. Unshackled in Sheffield, which brings us back to November 12, 1945, and the shopping trip to Sheffield. By autumn 1945, the re-education program had progressed to what British authorities called reality exposure. Carefully selected groups of German POWs, both male and female, were taken on supervised visits to British cities. The goal wasn't kindness exactly. It was strategic psychological operation. Show them that British civilians weren't the propaganda caricatures, that British cities, though bomb-damaged, weren't the hellscapes Goebbels had promised, that life in democracy looked different than they'd been taught. For the women, these trips carried additional weight. In Nazi ideology, women were the repositories of racial and cultural purity, the mothers of the future Volk. Their indoctrination had been different from men's, more focused on home, family, and the moral superiority of German civilization versus Anglo-American degeneracy. When Inga Probst walked into a Sheffield department store that November day, she was utterly unprepared for what she found. "The shop girl helped me find a cardigan in my size," she wrote in her diary that night. She spoke no German, I spoke little English, but we managed with gestures and smiles. She showed me 3 different colors. When I hesitated over the price, even though it wasn't my money, she whispered conspiratorially and showed me one on the sale rack. As if we were friends, as if I wasn't the enemy, as if I hadn't spent 3 years helping to shoot at British planes, helping to kill British boys. She treated me like a person. The trip included 16 women and 2 British officers, Captain Wilson and Lieutenant Joyce Collins. The women were given strict boundaries: stay together, return by 16 hours, no contact with German-speaking civilians. But within those boundaries, they were free to move, to browse, to exist as human beings rather than prisoners. Hildegard Kuhn spent 20 minutes in a bookshop, running her fingers over volumes in English, German, French. She later wrote to her sister, "They have German books, Goethe, Schiller, Heine. The British haven't burned our culture like we were told. They sell it in shops." Another woman, Lieselotte Brandt, encountered a British woman in a cafe who'd lost her son over Cologne. When Lieselotte's identity as a German POW was revealed through conversation with the supervising officer, the British woman went pale. For a terrible moment, Lieselotte braced for the hatred she'd been promised. Instead, the woman said quietly, "You're very young, too young for this war," and walked away, no screaming, no violence, just grief recognized across the enemy line. The unbearable truth. The shopping trips continued throughout late 1945 and into 1946, expanding to more camps and more prisoners. The British authorities documented these excursions meticulously. A report from the Prisoner of War Directorate, dated January 30th, 1946, noted, "Supervised town visits for female German POWs have produced marked psychological effects. Initial resistance and suspicion give way to confusion, then to various forms of acceptance. Approximately 65% of participants show measurable shifts in attitudes toward British society. 20% demonstrate active rejection of previous beliefs. 15% show entrenchment or minimal change. That 15% is important. Not every German woman POW underwent a sudden conversion. Some remained convinced Nazis, seeing kindness as weakness or deception. Some suffered complete psychological collapse, unable to reconcile reality with belief. And some occupied an agonizing middle ground, unable to believe the old lies, but unwilling to embrace the implications of the truth, because accepting that the British weren't monsters meant accepting that perhaps Germany were the monsters. And that was unbearable. Inga Probst's diary entries from December 1945 reveal this painful process. December 7th, 1945. If they lied about the British, what else did they lie about? The Jews. They told us the Jews were being resettled, given their own communities in the East, but the photographs from the camps, those bodies, those mountains of bodies, were those Jews? Was that resettlement? I cannot think about this. I cannot. December 14th, 1945. Hertha killed herself last night, hanged herself in the washroom. She left a note. I cannot live having served evil. But did we serve evil? Were we evil? I want to say we didn't know, but is that true? There were things we didn't ask about. Things we chose not to see. Is that the same as knowing? December 23rd, 1945. Captain Wilson brought us Christmas parcels from the Red Cross. She wished us Frohe Weihnachten in her terrible German accent. Some of the girls cried. I didn't cry. I don't know what I feel anymore. The suicide rate among German women POWs in British camps was approximately 0.8% between 1945 and 1947, lower than the male rate of 1.2%. But each case represented a mind that could not bridge the gap between what it had believed and what it now knew. Confronting the abyss. The most devastating aspect of the re-education program came in early 1946, when German POWs were shown footage from the concentration camps liberated by Allied forces. The screening at Lodge Moor on February 18, 1946, has been documented by multiple sources. Approximately 340 German women POWs were assembled in the camp's main hall. They were told they would watch footage of conditions in Germany, nothing more. Many expected to see their destroyed cities, their suffering people, confirmation that they too were victims. What they saw instead was hell. British Army cameraman footage from Bergen-Belsen. American footage from Dachau. Soviet footage from Majdanek. 23 minutes of skeletal survivors, mass graves, gas chambers, crematorium ovens, and the blank bureaucratic efficiency of industrialized murder. The lights came up on a room in chaos. Some women sat in stunned silence. Others wept uncontrollably. Several vomited. A handful screamed that it was lies, forgeries, British propaganda. One woman, identified in records only as prisoner 4782W, stood and shouted, "Where was this? When? Who did this?" When told these were German camps, run by the SS, filled with Jews, political prisoners, and others deemed undesirable by the regime she'd served, she collapsed. Inga Probst's diary entry for that day is brief. "We did this, we, Germans, us, I want to die," but she didn't die. None of the women in her barracks died, though 2 attempted suicide in the following week and were placed on medical watch. Instead, they faced the hardest task, continuing to live while carrying this knowledge. The resistance to truth. It would be historically dishonest to suggest that all German women POWs underwent sincere denazification. Human psychology is complex, and the defense mechanisms against world-shattering truth are powerful. Significant minority, estimates range from 15% to 30%, maintained their National Socialist beliefs despite all evidence presented. Some did so through compartmentalization. Yes, bad things happened, but Hitler didn't know, or it was a few bad actors, or it was exaggerated. Some embraced conspiracy theories. The footage was doctored, the newspapers were lies. The British and Americans had committed equal atrocities, but hid them. One particularly defiant prisoner, Margaret Hoffmann, a committed Nazi Party member and Signals auxiliary, wrote in a letter intercepted by British censors on March 3, 1946, "They show us horror films and expect us to weep and repent. But I know British propaganda when I see it. They bombed our cities, killed our children, and now they want us to feel guilty for defending ourselves. I will never give them the satisfaction." Hoffmann was among the approximately 3,200 German women POWs classified as Category A, ardent Nazis who showed no signs of ideological shift. These women were held longer, some until late 1947, and subjected to more intensive re-education efforts with mixed results. But for every Margarete Hoffmann, there was an Inga Probst or a Christa Vogel, women who couldn't maintain the lie once the evidence became overwhelming. The question became, what do you do with that realization? How do you live knowing you served evil even unknowingly? How do you reconcile the person you were with the person you must now become? The long return. Repatriation of German women POWs began in earnest in late 1946 and continued through 1948. By April 1947, approximately 11,000 of the 15,000 women held in British camps had been returned to Germany. The remainder included those classified as ardent Nazis, requiring further denazification, those awaiting war crimes investigations, and most surprisingly, those who didn't want to return. The Germany they would return to was unrecognizable. Cities lay in ruins. The economy had collapsed. Food was scarce. The occupying powers had divided the country into zones. And everywhere the question hung like smoke. What did you do during the war? What did you know? Inga Probst returned to Bremen on September 14, 1947. Her family home was rubble. Her father was dead, killed in an air raid in 1943. Her mother and younger sister were living in 2 rooms of a half-destroyed building, surviving on rations and black market trading. In her diary she wrote, September 15, 1947, Mutti held me for so long. She's so thin. Everything is grey and broken. She asked me if the British treated me terribly. I didn't know how to answer. How do I tell her that the British treated me better than I deserved? That they gave me more food than she has now? That they showed me the truth about what we did, what we supported? She still has a photograph of the Führer hidden in a drawer. I saw it, I said nothing. What can I say? The war destroyed her life and she still believes in him. I don't know who I am anymore. The readjustment was traumatic for many returning women POWs. In Germany, they encountered a population largely in denial, unwilling or unable to confront the full extent of Nazi crimes. The ones who'd experienced denazification in British camps often found themselves alienated, too changed for their families, too German for those who'd resisted. Some found purpose in reconstruction, throwing themselves into rebuilding their shattered country. Some emigrated, unable to live in Germany anymore. Some retreated into silence, never speaking of the war years. And some became activists, dedicating themselves to ensuring such blindness would never happen again. Voices from the aftermath. In 1978, British historian Helen Fry conducted a series of interviews with former German women POWs held in Britain. The testimonies, now archived at the Imperial War Museum, reveal the long-term psychological impact of confronting propaganda's collapse. Christa Vogel, then 62 years old, the shopping trip to Sheffield changed my life. It sounds absurd, doesn't it? That a trip to buy a cardigan could be revolutionary. But when that shopgirl smiled at me, when she treated me like a fellow human being, I couldn't maintain the hatred anymore. And without the hatred, the whole structure collapsed. Everything I'd believed was built on that foundation, that we were superior, that they were evil, that we were justified. Remove that foundation and it all falls down. Irmgard Meyer, then 58, people ask if I'm grateful to the British for re-educating me. I don't know if grateful is the word. They destroyed my world. Yes, it was a world built on lies, but it was my world. They were kind while doing it, which somehow made it worse. I couldn't hate them, I tried. It would have been easier to hate them. But they gave me tea and biscuits and took me to the cinema and treated me like a human being who could think and change. And that killed the person I was. Maybe that person needed to die, but it's still a kind of death. Not all voices were reflective. Some remained bitter. Margareta Hoffman, interviewed in 1981 at age 64, still defiant. The British won the war, so they got to write history. They want us to say we were monsters, that everything we believed was evil. I won't give them that. I served my country. I did my duty. If I had it to do over, I'd do the same. These voices, conflicted, painful, sometimes still resistant, remind us that confronting propaganda is not a simple process of revealing truth and watching lies evaporate. The human mind defends itself against world-shattering revelations. Identity is not easily unmade and remade, and complicity, once recognized, is a burden carried for life. The ones who stayed. Perhaps the most surprising outcome of the German women POW experience in Britain was the approximately 800 women who, given the choice, chose not to return to Germany. Some married British men they'd met during captivity, relationships that were scandalous, complicated and often surprisingly successful. Others secured work permits and simply stayed, building new lives in the country they'd been taught to hate. A few even testified for the British prosecution at war crimes trials, their testimony about German military operations and Nazi indoctrination, considered credible precisely because they were former true believers. The British government's handling of these cases reveals the complexity of the situation. A Home Office memorandum dated November 7, 1947, noted, "We find ourselves in the awkward position of having enemy nationals who wish to remain in Britain while we simultaneously attempt to repatriate displaced persons. The German women in question pose no security threat. Many have skills useful for reconstruction, and forcibly removing them seems contrary to the very principles we fought to defend. Recommend individual case-by-case assessment." One such case was Lieselotte Brandt, the woman who'd encountered the grieving British mother in the Sheffield cafe. She married a British veteran in 1948, changed her name to Elizabeth Brand, and spent the rest of her life in Yorkshire. In a 1984 interview, she said, "Germany was my past. Britain became my future. I couldn't go back to a place where everyone was still pretending we didn't know, where we were all supposed to be victims together. Here I could be honest about what I'd been and work to become something better." Reflections on Propaganda and Truth. The story of German women POWs discovering that British lies were truth offers profound insights into the nature of propaganda, belief, and the painful process of deprogramming. Nazi propaganda worked not just through repetition, but through isolation, by controlling information, by making doubt treasonous, by surrounding people entirely with a single narrative. It created a hermetically sealed worldview. The German women auxiliaries believed British cruelty not because they were stupid or uniquely evil, but because they'd never been exposed to contradictory evidence, and because the propaganda confirmed their existing tribal loyalties and fears. The British approach, humane treatment, gradual exposure to evidence, allowing prisoners to reach their own conclusions, was remarkably sophisticated for its time. Modern deprogramming techniques still use similar methods, provide safety, introduce cognitive dissonance through evidence rather than argument, and give people time to adjust. But the British weren't purely altruistic. This was strategic psychological warfare, designed to create a generation of Germans who would not start another war. The kindness was genuine, but it was also tactical. That it worked, that many of these women did change, did confront the truth, did carry that knowledge back to Germany, suggests that facts, given time and space to work, can sometimes overcome even the most sophisticated lies. Yet we must also acknowledge the limits. Some never changed. Some changed only superficially. And even those who genuinely confronted the truth often carried psychological scars for life. Belief is not easily abandoned, especially when that belief is tied to identity, community, and purpose. To reject National Socialism meant, for many of these women, rejecting their entire adolescence, their service, their pride, their sense of having mattered, the cognitive dissonance of walking free through Sheffield, of being offered tea instead of torture, of being treated with basic human decency by the enemy. This was the crack that let reality in. Not lectures, not punishment, but the simple, undeniable evidence of their own senses contradicting everything they'd been taught. In the end, approximately 12,400 German women POWs passed through British camps between 1944 and 1948. They came as enemies, believers in a hateful ideology, certain of British cruelty. Most left as something else, uncertain, damaged, changed. Some became Democrats, some remained defiant, most occupied a confused middle ground. But the unshackling of their hands in that Sheffield street, the permission to walk freely and discover that the British were human beings rather than monsters, that moment of cognitive rupture echoed through the rest of their lives. Inga Probst's final diary entry from her time as a POW, written on September 12, 1947, 2 days before her repatriation. "Tomorrow I go home to a Germany that doesn't exist anymore. The one I loved is gone, either destroyed by bombs or revealed as an illusion. I don't know if I'll ever stop being angry at the British. Not for what they did to me, but for being kind. It would be so much easier if they'd been the monsters we were promised. Then I could hate them and cling to what I believed. Instead, they offered me tea and showed me truth, and expected me to be strong enough to face it. I don't know if I am, but I'll spend the rest of my life trying." She died in 2003 at age 76, having spent 5 decades as a teacher in Bremen, dedicating her life to ensuring her students learned to question, to think critically, and to never again accept comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths. The women who walked unshackled through British streets, confronted with kindness when they expected cruelty, discovered something terrifying, that everything they'd built their identity upon was false. And in rebuilding themselves from that rubble, they became living testaments to both propaganda's power and its ultimate fragility when confronted with persistent, undeniable reality. Their story is not a comfortable one. There are no pure heroes here, no simple redemption arcs, just the messy, painful, incomplete process of humans confronting the lies they believed and the evil they served, and the quiet courage of continuing to live with that knowledge.